Now, you must warn me if I wobble this camera about too much. I'm still getting used to the selfie stick. My job after that is learning to use the tripod so it actually holds still. Anyway, it's all new, all this stuff. It's all new to me. These are things from my rainbow shelves that are favourites. Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafon. I think that's how you pronounce it. I don't speak Spanish, unfortunately. Now, this is a book that came out in 2004. It was 20 years ago, which is almost unbelievable. A kind of biblio-mystery set in Madrid in the 1930s, in which characters from mystery stories come to life and start pursuing our heroes. It's about a bookshop that contains all the missing books in the world, hidden away in Madrid. That's what I remember anyway, and I remember a very dense, wonderful atmosphere, spooky, that made me read all the sequels to this series, to this first book. It kind of rescued me, this book, in 2004. It was a funny time in lots of ways. I was moving cities, moving jobs, and I'd got stuck in a rut with reading, as they say now. And this is the only time this has ever happened to me in my whole life, I think. But I didn't read anything for about a month. I read stuff, obviously, but I didn't read a whole book. Never happened before or since. And it's all the fault of a certain writer, somebody who's... it's unfair to mention who it was. It was a British literary author. And I remember sitting in the house in Norwich and flinging this book across the room after about 50 pages, thinking, why should I be interested in these characters or these people or their awful concerns and the fiddly-faddly writing? And this particular book put me off reading forever, which was unfortunate, because there I was being a writer and being somebody who taught writing, who was about to start a new lectureship in a new city. Very difficult to suddenly go off books, which is what I did, thanks to this particular author, whose name will remain secret. Or you might squeeze it out of the secret out of me at some point. Anyway, after about a month, I was in Manchester, and Waterstones had one of their promotions on, shoving somebody's book in your face, as they occasionally do, with a discount and a poster and a pile of them. And I fell for it, and I fell for the Shadow of the Wind. I bought it immediately and took it off to a cafe at the end of Deansgate that had this marvellous veranda overlooking Castlefield Basin, which is all different now. It's full of skyscrapers and all that stuff. But it was a lovely, lovely cafe. I don't know if it's still there. I'm going to check that out and see if it's possible still to read peacefully all afternoon in Atlas Cafe in Manchester on Deansgate. I'm going to try that when the weather gets nice. I'll take you with me. And I sat there all afternoon with biscuits and coffee, and I read the first, however long, 100 pages of The Shadow of the Wind and fell back in love with books. So I've got everything to thank Carlos Ruiz Zafon for. About 4 or 5 years later, the second in the series came out, and I think it was a prequel. I'm not sure. I get the chronology of this series mixed up. And I bought it in London the first day it was out because I was due there to do some recording, actually. It's when we were making the first Nest Cottage series of Doctor Who adventures with Tom Baker. And I was down for a few days, and I sat on a Sunday evening in Russell Square beside a tree in the sun reading what was it called? The Angels something. I've forgotten the title. But Carlos Ruiz Zafon's second novel, second in this series. And that was a magical experience as well. So he's got good associations for me as a writer. Right, next one. Floating Worlds. This is a beautiful book. A friend gave me this for a birthday, I think, several years ago. My friend Nick. And it's a lovely book published by Pomegranate Press in America. They do lovely things. And it's a a book. Just found the postcard, a John Aiken postcard inside from Nick. Typical. A book about a friendship between the writer and illustrator Edward Gorey and his kind of protege Peter F. Neumeier, who was a kids writer as well. And they're slightly romantic, I'd say, friendship. Although I think Neumeier was straight. It's still a romance. And we see their postcards and the illustrated envelopes that Gorey sent him. Beautiful stuff. It's all kept, it's all preserved, and it tells this fantastic story of them collaborating on new work, and of course features throughout really beautiful artwork from Gorey, of whom I'm a massive fan. And somewhere I've got the big biography that came out 5 or 6 years ago, and that was a whole Christmas I spent reading that. His books are tiny, slim, with about 15 words in, but the books about him are voluminous, to use one of my favourite words. So Floating Worlds is a lovely book about Gorey. The biography, which has a very eccentric title, A Posthumous Life, maybe? Something like that. And there's a book by Alexander Theroux, which is the first book I read about Gorey, which is just delightful, written by his neighbour who became friends with him. I love biographies, whether they're stories of friendships. One of my favourites being Tekla Clark's book about W.H. Auden, where the story you're following isn't birth to death of the main character, the main kind of fated, famous person. It's the kind of wending story of how the friendship works. And those are my favourite kinds of memoirs. I think the other one is Brinnin's book about Capote. Again, a love story, a kind of hidden love story. But what a fantastic book that is. As I talk more and more about books, you'll find out that I've got this massive compulsion when it comes to books about Truman Capote, and also books about friendship, and books that are very personal and partial memoirs. Here's a favourite, Carol Matthews. Her books, she writes romantic comedies. They're often scabrous and funny and rude, and her characters are all too real. And she's got a wonderful sense of humour and a wonderful feeling for Christmas, actually. She used to do, I think Carol's saying that she's retired. I hope not. I hope she carries on writing novels. She has written masses of novels, but I hope she'll write more still. She's enjoying her gardening and retirement, though, I think, and gadding about. The Christmas ones I absolutely love. This is Christmas Cakes and Mistletoe Nights from about 2017. I can remember sitting in here reading this and reading all through the day when I should have been working. Here's another. These are all dark blue books, I realise, from this end of the shelf. Star Wars, Heir to the Empire, Timothy Zahn. This is a fantastic Star Wars sequel, the first licensed sequel to the original trilogy of movies, I think, in about 90-something, 91. Wow. So it wasn't even 10 years after Return of the Jedi, we get our first return to that world. And it properly says on the front, the saga continues, and it's the beginning of that whole expanded universe that ran from then till Disney bought it, and they kind of rebooted, a soft reboot, as they say, that whole Star Wars universe. Star Wars novels I've got a complicated relationship with, in that I think there's lots of them I just wouldn't bother with. Lots of them are just kind of fighting and spaceships and things, but that's true of most science fiction. But they have a special place in my heart because one of the earliest full novels I read was the original novelization of Star Wars in 1977 when I was 7. It's on the cover that it's George Lucas, but I believe it was Alan Dean Foster who then wrote the very first sequel, Splinter of the Mind's Eye. I'm being really Star Wars geeky. I'm not, honestly. But I read them when I was 7 or 8, so they've got a very, very special place in my heart. The early books that you read carve out a particular space inside your imagination, I think, and it's a kind of cave. It's like a pellucidar in your mind, pellucidar being the underground land at the Earth's core by Edgar Rice Burroughs. I believe. I think that's what he called it. And that's what books do early in your life, I think. The space carved out in your head later, you've got less space, I think. And you just keep layering on top of those initial caverns. It's why it's important that people read early on in life and find their own books and not just have things foisted upon them that adults think they ought to read. That's deadly, I think. Lack of choice is deadly. It's why I deplored in the last 25 years everybody reading Harry Potter and all that stuff. Just like as if there was only 2 or 3 books, 2 or 3 authors in the world. Just appalling. And I think the industry suffered and everybody suffered from that. They were nice school stories with a bit of magic in. There was lots of other books out as well. I know, I was writing some of the other books that got neglected. Anyway, here's a kid's classic, Little Women. I never read this until adulthood because the town I came from, you couldn't really walk around with girls' books. as a young gay boy, you would have been kicked in. I did watch all these things on the telly, all the serializations and dramatizations of things like Anne of Green Gables and Little Princess and The Secret Garden and all those things I watched with my mum and old movies. But the actual books took me a long time to get to. And I was sad when I did because I loved this book. I loved Little Women. And also I loved Anne of Green Gables and Little House on the Prairie and those books when I got to those too. Too late. There's no such thing as too late unless you never read them at all. But it would be nice to have had them earlier in my life. Boys' books are very blinkered, I think, in lots of ways, or books written especially for boys are very blinkered. These books like Little Women and Anne of Green Gables are all about appealing to the idea of enlarging your sympathies, enlarging the heart, seeing the world through other people's eyes. I think boys are encouraged to be more singular and independent. It's a very, very sexist, crappy old world. Very, crappy old sexist world. Here's probably my favourite living novelist, Anne Tyler, who I've read for about 34 years. And we shared a publisher at one point in the mid-90s, and I was honoured to share a publisher with her. She writes about modern-day Baltimore, beginning in the 60s, going up to the present day. She's taken us through generations of these families who are living fairly ordinary lives. They're family sagas. They're families in which people wander away and then wander back, and decades pass, and people come back as strangers, or strangers turn up and they're woven into the fabric of families. It's a kind of very gentle progress, a gentle erosion of time. I've loved them all. This is the one, Ladder of Years, which in some ways distills lots of her themes. She's at the height of her powers in the mid-90s. And it was the book that was out, or coming out, when I first got a book deal with the same publisher, with Chatto and Windus. And in fact, there's a postcard in it from our shared editor saying, "See you on Monday," when I was going into the office to talk about editing Marked for Life, my first novel. And so that has a very special place. And I remember that arriving in the post in my house as my whole gang of friends were rushing off to the train to go to the Lake District for a day out in spring 1995. And I remember starting it on the train for that short journey. Just magical. I'm going to stop because I've already gone on too long. I haven't gone through my pile of books at all. But I will come back tomorrow and do some more talking at you then. Okay. Press like below and do subscribe and leave a comment. I love the comments I've been getting. There's some really sweet ones. And it's fantastic to have that sense of a community out there beyond the rainy outside. Okay, talk soon.